Darkling, a word that conjures up disgust in some and absolute dread in others. It calls forth images of the darkest pits of damnation in the minds of every man, woman, and child who hears it. It is a term I find quite distasteful myself, yet we use it so frequently, despite the bitter taste it leaves on our lips. Elves, orcs, gnomes, goblins, anyone who is not human is a darkling. But where did the word come from? Did it slip from someone's tongue by accident, or was it unearthed from some lost text within the holy tomes of Onan? Who can say how or why it came to be? All I know is that the word itself is like a blade, one that cuts without leaving a mark on the flesh.
Chapter 6.
The streets of Lowtown were lively and bustling as the citizens of Potentia began their early celebrations for the Fireflies Walk. Every autumn, on the night after the second full moon of the season, waves of fireflies descended upon the city, dazzling the people with their brilliant display. These weren't just the typical green fireflies found in the wild, but a kaleidoscope of colors, from the deepest blue to the most vibrant red. People laughed, sang, drank, and shared sweet cakes. It was a time to enjoy life, to fall in love, to forget worries, if only for a night. The streets of Lowtown were cleaner than usual during this time, and crime all but vanished, not because of a heightened presence of sentinels or constables, but because no one wished to bring harm to others on a night meant for joy. Thomas leaned back in his seat, biting into a sweet red apple as he watched the crowds move through the streets, their laughter and voices rising into the night sky. He took in the mingling scents of roasted nuts, spiced cider, and lantern smoke, the festive energy buzzing around him. But he remained still, waiting. "Come on, Rod, I can't wait for you all night," he muttered to himself as a group of people passed by the patio of the Moonlight Walk, laughing and singing. "I've got my own assignments to work on." "Can I get you something to drink, Sir Bard?" the lovely elven girl asked, the silvery moonlight gleaming in her eyes. "Or perhaps something else?" She smiled bashfully. Her nearly translucent white dress clung to her body in just the right places, the fabric teasingly thin, emphasizing the soft peaks of her nipples, an invitation meant to tempt wandering eyes. The delicate scent of fresh wildflowers surrounded her, a fragrance that only served to heighten desire. "No, thank you, fair lady," Thomas replied, looking up at her while rolling the apple in his hand. She could have easily passed for human, if not for the moonlight reflecting in her eyes and the delicate, pointed tips of her ears. "While your offer is tempting, I'm afraid I have neither the coin nor the time to indulge myself." "Are you sure?" she whispered softly, tracing the tips of her fingers along Thomas's cheek before sliding her other hand down the curve of her breast. "My master says your songs have more than earned our hospitality." "Quite sure, my lady. However, I would enjoy a cup of mulled wine." Thomas removed 2 silver bits from his pocket and placed them into her soft, delicate hand. "Oh, there is no charge, Sir Bard," she said, glancing down at the coins, a hint of shock in her eyes. "As I said, my master has offered you whatever you wish." "The coins are not for your master," Thomas said warmly, turning his gaze back to the full moon. "They are for you. Spend them as you wish." "You are truly as kind as my sisters have said." She slowly bowed her head, then backed away from him and walked into the pleasure house. "Good evening, Sir Bard," a soft, distinctively feminine voice said as Thomas eased back into his seat. "Do you have a song for?" Thomas smiled warmly and rolled his eyes. She was a plain-faced girl, neither stunning nor ugly, with common brown hair that matched her equally common brown eyes. Yet beneath her unremarkable features, her smile held a quiet beauty of its own. "I've been waiting here for over an hour, Rod. It's not like I have all the time in the Empire." Rod, short for Rodina, rarely dressed so plainly, which immediately caught his attention. As a whisper, she was usually adorned in elaborate disguises to gather information. "Wait, what's wrong?" Rod sank into the seat beside Thomas with a long sigh, her plain brown eyes staring off into the distance as if lost in thought. Absent-mindedly, she tugged at the hem of her trousers. "Nothing, I promise. Nothing, really," she said, with a quick smile, though her eyes betrayed a flicker of unease. She grabbed the apple from his hand and took a bite. "Can't I just enjoy a night with an old friend?" she added, her words muffled by a mouthful of apple. "After all, it is the night before the Fireflies." Thomas had first met Rod 3 autumns ago, during his first visit to the academy at the age of 13 springs. In that time, the two had grown very close. At first, he had mistaken her for a boy, but soon realized his mistake after a particularly embarrassing moment at the bathhouse. As time moved forward, her feelings for him became evident, then lead to them sharing each other's warmth and touch, once in the comfort of Thomas's bed, after a long night of drinking. Though she knew in her heart that she loved him, she also understood that his heart belonged to another. "No, you can't." Thomas playfully snatched the apple back from Rod, then narrowed his eyes as he looked at her. "So out with it." Rod lowered her gaze to the cobblestones between their feet. "I think I'm in trouble, Thomas," she whispered, worry lacing her tone as she tugged at the hem of her trousers once again. "When are you not in trouble?" Thomas said, mockingly, tossing the remains of his apple onto the street. "No." She turned her head and looked up at him. "I mean, I am in real trouble, Tom." Thomas froze for a moment, a pinprick of worry nagging at him. She only called him Tom when things were truly serious. "All right, tell me what's going on." She started to speak, but fell silent as the elven slave girl approached the table, carrying a steaming mug of mulled wine. "Here you are, Sir Bard," she said, placing the mug down with a warm smile. "Are you sure this is all you desire?" The low cut of her dress shifted slightly as she leaned forward, revealing a teasing hint of her breast. "No, that will be all. Thank you," Thomas replied, glancing back at Rod and noticing the small flicker of hurt in her eyes. "As you wish, Sir Bard," the elven girl said, her tone laced with quiet defeat before she gracefully turned away and moved on to other patrons. "You don't have to spare my heart, Tom," Rod said with a smile, though her voice wavered as she fought back a tear. "She's lovely, and you should enjoy yourself. I don't mind waiting." "Rod, I should have spared your heart last spring, not pinned it to the wall of my bedroom," Thomas said regretfully as he pushed the steaming cup in front of her. It wasn't as if he had planned for her to fall in love with him, nor had he used her. It was simply something that happened, a fleeting moment in time. He wished he could love her, but his heart, his very soul, belonged to someone long since gone. "The life that was is now the life that is?" Thomas whispered to himself. Then, as realization struck, he snapped his gaze back to her. "You're trying to change the subject." Rod closed her eyes briefly, savoring the warmth of the sweet mulled wine on her lips. "You're right. It's my problem, not yours, Tom. Just let me deal with it on my own." "No, you dragged me out here and made me wait when I could be off on my own assignment," Thomas said, his tone stern and demanding. "You owe me that much, so come on. What trouble have you gotten yourself into?" Rod pushed the warm mug back in front of Thomas and smiled. "I just love it when you get all demanding with me." Her words were yet another attempt to change the subject. "Rod!" Thomas's voice carried a note of irritation as he picked up the mug and emptied its contents. She had always hidden her problems behind a facade of playfulness, choosing to deal with them on her own. But it never worked. Inevitably, it would backfire, and she would come to him once she was in over her head. "All right." Rod let out a long sigh. The professor assigned me to the constables to help with the investigation of the Darkling. And what have you found out so far? Or is that privileged information? Thomas asked, setting the empty mug back onto the table. No, it's not privileged information. Rod stared off into the distance, absently tugging at the fabric of her tunic. But I think I might have found a connection between a student and a magus within the walls of Montos. Do you have a name that could lead the sentinels to the killer? Thomas asked, glancing around for any potential eavesdroppers. I do, but it's just an accusation. I don't have any hard proof yet, but there seems to be a larger plot at play beyond just killing lordlings. Rod's worried expression deepened. While I was looking into the deaths, one of them stood out to me. Which one? Thomas asked, as a few snowflakes began to drift from the sky. The unnamed noble girl found by Sutter's Creek. Rod looked up at the night sky. Why was her body the only one the Darkling tried to hide? So I tried to find out who she was, but it led me nowhere. I even called in a few favors to get a peek at the list of incoming novices to the academy to see if anyone was missing. And? Were there any missing? Thomas asked, following her line of reasoning. No, not a single one. The list even included the lordlings who died during the Heart's Wrath attack. Rod pulled up the hood of her robe as a chilly wind blew down the street. So, how does that put you in trouble? Thomas asked, pulling up the collar of his coat. It's not like you learned anything. I know, but I realized a few nights later that someone has been watching and following me. Rod started to stand from her seat. That's what took me so long to get here. I had to make sure they weren't tailing me. It was hard for Thomas to believe anyone could track her. While Rod often got in over her head, she was nearly impossible to keep tabs on, a skill that had kept her alive. I don't doubt your concerns, but are you sure you're not just being paranoid? Thomas asked. At first, yes, but then I turned my eye back on my follower and started tracking them. Rod watched as Thomas stood from his seat and slung Emma over his shoulder. They're good, Thomas. I mean really good. But I managed to follow their path through Potentia, and I found out that they come here to the Moonlight Walk once a week. And let me guess, Thomas said with a smug smile. Tonight just happens to be the night they make their way here. Can't a girl show a boy a good time? Rod smirked back at him. Come on, let's go. The two of them walked down the street in opposite directions, blending in with the pedestrians before slipping into the shadows. They regrouped near the back entrance of the pleasure house. Are you sure they come through the back entrance? Thomas whispered as they crouched behind an old rain barrel. I mean, if they frequent this place that often, wouldn't they be a known guest? One of the most basic lessons taught by the professor when tracking a mark was never to follow their footsteps. Follow their vices instead. A target might change their routines to throw off pursuit, but their vices, whether drink, lust, or something else, never changed. The lesson had served Thomas and Rod well in the past. While spying on an influential tradesman suspected of leading a conspiracy against the Merchants' Guild, they kept losing track of him. He never took the same route twice, never slept in the same location. It was nearly impossible to pin him down, until Rod discovered that he had a mistress he was keeping secret from his wife. That's what I thought at first, but... Rod peeked around the edge of the barrel as the back door slowly creaked open. The same elven girl who had made advances toward Thomas stepped into the alleyway. I never found anyone out of the ordinary, except for her. She always slips out the back door around this time. Maybe it's just a little back alley fun, but she always comes back inside with a sad look on her face. This is the first time I've been able to watch her outside. All right, let's see what she does then. Thomas lowered his voice and watched as the elven girl stood motionless, the moonlight spilling over her. Just then, movement in the shadows caught Thomas's eye. A short, slim figure stepped into the alley, clad in a black tunic and trousers trimmed in red, robes like those of a magus. Their hood was pulled low, and a cloth covered their mouth and nose, obscuring their features. But their green eyes, gleaming in the moonlight, were unmistakable. "Oh, shit!" Rod gasped. "Is that the Darkling?" Thomas nodded. The one reported sighting had described the assailant as wearing the colors of a magus. However, there had been no mention of their height or build. The eyes, on the other hand, were the most distinctive detail in the report. The eyes of an elf, the very feature that had earned the killer their name. "Yeah, that's them," Thomas said, as the Darkling stepped closer to the elven girl. "We should report back to the sentinels and constables." "You're right, but let's watch a little longer," Rod whispered back, her hand drifting toward the hilt of her blade. "This is the closest anyone has gotten to him. It might also be our chance to catch him. If he makes a mistake, you and I could take him out." The two of them watched as the elven girl pulled the Darkling into an embrace and began to cry. They held each other, not like lovers, but something deeper. A sinking feeling settled in Thomas's gut. Something about the moment felt off, and then it hit him. He reached out to place a hand on Rod's shoulder, to warn her, but it was too late. "His back is to us." Rod drew her sword and leaped gracefully over the barrel, her footwork so light that a pin drop would have been deafening in comparison. "It's a trap!" Thomas yelled, as a tingling sensation of the shift washed over both of them. The Darkling pushed the elven girl back toward the door, then drew their sword with their left hand, while flicking the fingers of their right toward the shadows of the alley. Rod drove the tip of her blade forward with practiced precision, aiming to pierce the Darkling's heart, but the sharp clang of steel echoed through the alley as her strike met unexpected resistance. Her eyes widened, a gasp slipping from her lips. A shadowy black hand had caught her blade, its surface shifting like smoke yet solid as iron. Thomas leapt over the barrel just as quickly, though not nearly as silently, landing at Rod's side with his sword at the ready. They pressed their backs together as 6 shadowy figures seeped out from the darkness, their forms twisting unnaturally, like they were barely bound to reality. "Shadows," Thomas hissed, quickly reaching to his side and pulling out 2 glass vials, handing one to Rod. A low, guttural whisper filled the alley, though no lips moved. The air grew heavy, thick with a freezing dampness that clung to their skin. The shadows did not breathe, did not step. They slithered forward, stretching and unraveling before reforming in flickering, grotesque shapes. Their hands, clawed and elongated, reached out, curling like grasping roots. Shadows were evil spirits of violent individuals, trapped within their own darkness after death. Any magus capable of summoning and controlling such things was not only talented but dangerously skilled. A sharp, icy chill crawled up Thomas's spine as one of the shadows tilted its head too far to the side, bones that weren't there audibly snapping. Another mouthed silent words, over and over, though no sound came forth. Thomas gave the vial a sharp shake, mixing the contents. A bright green alchemical glow began to emanate from it, casting flickering, unnatural shadows against the alley walls. "Light is the only thing that can hold them at bay." Rod fumbled with her own vial, nearly dropping it. "Oh, I hate these things so much." Thomas glanced at the Darkling and was surprised to see they were still there. This would have been their best chance to escape. They could have vanished back into the darkness while the shadows dealt with him and Rod. But they didn't move. They just stood there, the moonlight flickering in their eyes as clouds momentarily obscured the full moon. Purely on instinct, Thomas raised his sword to block the first shadow's attack. However, Its incorporeal talons passed effortlessly through the blade, leaving a trail of frost in their wake. A cold, sharp pain shot up his arm as the shadow's claws raked across the hand holding the glowing vial. The pain wasn't just in his flesh. It burrowed deeper, spreading through his bones and into his skull. It was like drinking an icy beverage too quickly, the searing chill stabbing behind his eyes. His fingers trembled, nearly losing their grip on the only protection he had against these beings. They were trapped. The Darkling had played them perfectly. That was why they had waited. They weren't the type to walk away and leave this encounter to chance. No, this one was smart, a killer. While their attack on the Lordlings might have been vicious and emotional, they did not take half measures or leave the task to others. They would do it themselves and leave no room for mistakes. "Now what?" Rod asked, moving her vial side to side as the shadows flinched, tempted to strike. "I don't know." Thomas scanned the alley for anything that could shift the odds in their favor. One of them could attempt a light spell, but neither he nor Rod was particularly adept at casting in the heat of battle. Spellcasting required concentration, and with the speed of these entities, even a moment's lapse could mean death. And that wasn't even the worst of it. The Darkling was still watching, still waiting, and if they tried to cast, it would take little effort for them to disrupt the spell entirely. "So, are we fucked?" Rod snapped as another shadow lunged at her, its ethereal claws nearly raking across her face. "Yeah, looks that way." Thomas flinched as a shadow charged toward him, stopping just short when he quickly raised the light in front of him. "How do you always get me into this kind of trouble?" "I told you, I wanted to show you a good time." Rod laughed, lifting her light into the air and shaking it lightly for Thomas to see. "Rod, your definition of a good time is quite different." Thomas smiled, glancing down at his sword. "But I think that will work." Without another word, Thomas and Rod threw their vials into the air and shifted their swords to the flat side. As the glowing green vials fell in front of them, they swung their blades, shattering the glass and scattering the contents in a perfect arc around them, coating the edges of their weapons in the luminous liquid. The shadows flickered and recoiled as Thomas and Rod took the offensive. Thomas drove the tip of his blade through the black mass at the center of the shadow to his left, while Rod did the same to the one on her right. Both flinched, as if startled by a deafening scream, yet no sound came from the shadows. Thomas knew these things couldn't be killed. They were already dead, but he did know that the light caused them pain. "Oh!" Rod screamed as a black talon raked across her leg, sending her crashing to her knees. Gritting her teeth, she swung her sword outward, striking the offending hand and driving the shadow back. The pain flared white-hot, nearly dragging her into unconsciousness. Thomas glanced down at her for only a moment, and that was when the real fight began. The Darkling rushed at his exposed back, their blade whistling through the night air. The tip sliced cleanly through the fabric of his tunic and severed the leather strap of Emma. The wound wasn't as deep as it could have been, leaving only a thin red cut, but his loot tumbled to the ground. Thomas immediately turned his attention to the Darkling and struck back, aiming for their throat. The green glow of his sword left an afterimage of light as it sliced through the air. With a movement smoother than flowing water, the Darkling dropped low, effortlessly evading the attack. In a single fluid motion, they countered, slashing across Thomas's thighs. Just like before, the cut was not deep, leaving only a thin wound. Once again, Rod screamed as a shadow drove the tip of its claw through her shoulder. She began to shake as her blade fell from her hands onto the ground. Thomas quickly turned, slicing through the shadow's outstretched arm. The creature recoiled, leaving Rod wounded, and collapsed on the dirty cobblestone alleyway. Before Thomas could react, the Darkling struck again. the tip of their blade slicing across his thighs and forcing him to the ground. In a last, desperate attempt, Thomas swung his sword toward the darkling, the final traces of alchemical light fading from its surface. Breathing heavily, he couldn't help but think of how hopelessly outmatched he was against this assassin. Once again, the sound of steel echoed through the alley as his weapon clattered to the ground, his failed strike leaving him disarmed. Exhausted, Thomas slowly looked up the length of the blade now resting beneath his chin, his gaze traveling to the haunting moonlit eyes of his foe. A simple flick was all they needed to end his life, so he waited for the inevitable end that never came. Then he saw it, the elven slave girl rising to her feet and running down the alleyway, vanishing into the night. And it dawned on him. The darkling hadn't just been waiting to see if the shadows could defeat him and Rod. They had been stalling, giving the girl time to flee. Slowly, the darkling withdrew their blade from Thomas's chin and sheathed it. The shadows melted back into the darkness. Without breaking eye contact, they reached into their pocket, pulled out a single silver coin, and flicked it at Thomas's feet. Thomas flinched as the coin rang out across the cobblestones. Then, without a word, the darkling stepped back into the shadows and vanished from sight. "Rod, how bad are you hurt?" Thomas turned and looked down at her as the overwhelming pain seemed to lessen, if only slightly. "Bad enough, but I'll live," she gasped, then winced, reaching up to clutch her wounded shoulder. "Why didn't he finish the job? It's not like he couldn't have." "I'm not entirely sure," Thomas groaned as he pushed himself to his feet. "Something tells me they fully intended to kill us, but at the last moment they had a change of heart. Instead, they left us with a warning, or a message." "And just what was the message?" Rod asked, as Thomas picked up the coin from the ground and held it out to her. "The message was that they spared our lives out of respect for someone else," Thomas said, as he gingerly helped Rod to her feet before reaching down to retrieve Emma. "How do you know that's what they meant?" "They didn't even say a word." Thomas looked at the cut strap of his lute, then back at her. "Because it costs exactly 1 silver to replace this leather strap on Emma," Thomas said, his tone certain. "So tell me, what is the name of the student and the magus connected to all of this?" "I'm not really sure who the magus is just yet," Rod admitted as they leaned on each other for support, slowly making their way out of the alley. "But the student is Lady Lalana Syncrad of House Syncrad." Thomas's eyes narrowed at the name. "All right, let's get that shoulder looked at and get you to lay low. I'm pretty sure the darkling would have no qualms about killing you." Rod looked back over her shoulder into the dark corners of the alley, as if bracing for another attack. "He's still watching us, isn't he?" Thomas nodded slowly, wincing as the pain from his wounds flared. "Yes, they are."